Hi there, and welcome to the Markets UK podcast. And this is your host Nick Shepley, and we're going to be talking for about 10 minutes on a little weekly diet of politics, history, economics, and whatever. This week, I want to talk about the idea of amnesia, because something very strange has happened all over the Western world. In America, Britain, Europe, and beyond, we seem to have concluded, as societies, that not only does the past have nothing to teach us, but also that there is little real point in teaching it properly to our children. Now, I know I've started this week's column sounding like a curmudgeonly Daily Mail columnist, getting myself in a froth about the youth of today. But when I am not writing this every week, or talking about this to you guys on the podcast every week, I'm also a secondary school history teacher, so I know what I'm talking about. We have a curious paradox at play in our societies, whereby high street bookshops are crammed with history books, often very good ones, and sales are buoyant. The market for history writing is very big, but we also have millions upon millions of people who don't even have a surface level of knowledge about our past. An alarming exit poll from a Hollywood film about World War II several years ago revealed that most US teenagers interviewed didn't know what decade the Second World War was fought in, or who the US president at the time was. Before British readers tut and roll their eyes too much, the same poll was carried out this side of the Atlantic with largely similar results. How has this happened? Why has this happened? How have we got here? In Germany recently, evidence emerged of a similar trend. And if there is one country in the world where the education system was fully geared up not to forgetting the past, it used to be Germany. There are a number of competing theories. The first I'd like to call the endless now theory. Why bother with knowing about the past when there is so much to do in the present? Modern consumerism, with all its pleasures and vices, does not facilitate the conditions whereby we can think about the past. Our thoughts are focused on the present, because spending, buying and consuming is in the here and now. Mentally for us, it also exists in the near future, as we anticipate the next iPhone or Hollywood blockbuster to hit the movie theatres. Consumerism, this all-pervading force in our lives that has swept all competing ideals and ideologies in its path over the last century, doesn't operate like a conventional censor. It sells us history along with everything else. So maybe it's part of the problem, but not the complete picture. Across the political divide, the educational system in Britain and the US has come under fire in recent years for producing generations with no understanding of history, not just of the basic facts, but also of its relevance to us as individuals. The history teaching of the 1950s and 60s, argues our current Education Secretary and arch-reactionary Michael Gove, was history in its perfected form, because it told a linear narrative of events, and students knew what happened, when and why, and we've retreated from this to our great loss. There are a few merits to this, but also a number of problems. The history Michael Gove speaks of was called the Whig interpretation of history, and it's largely a story of human progress, of things gradually getting better over time. And it's not necessarily a given that all human history is the history of progress. Much like Marxist historiography, that all history is born of material conditions it arises from, and that history is a series of steps forward until a classless workers' paradise, one actually has to chisel off the bits of the past that don't fit in with either of these two models. Michael Gove is right, however, when he states that the problem stems from a lack of basic knowledge about the past, that historical chapters and events are taught without any context. Recently, a friend of mine, who I spent a summer learning about B-17 bombers with, told me that in his middle school, history has become a mere adjunct to other subjects. So if it was numeracy week and the maths teacher was teaching trigonometry, then the history specialist, i.e. an IT, English or PE teacher who'd read a few history books, would then have to teach something about ancient Egypt, pyramids. In that term, he added, the Tudors, the Victorians and the Egyptians had been taught, making for a very confused group of children. Children are very perceptive, as we know, far more perceptive than we give them credit for. And they can tell when something clearly doesn't matter very much to adults, and they internalise this value for the rest of their lives. They are looking to us to show them what is important and what matters. We are their means of selecting a quote-unquote truth about the world. The decision to make history non-compulsory after the age of 14 in the UK has sent a powerful message to teenagers. And if the subject was poorly handled prior to GCSE, no wonder they are reluctant to take it as one of their qualifications. Now we have two generations of people having been through this process. Parents who were at school in the 1980s are quite happy to tell their children that the past has no value and no meaning, and that participating in the endless now is the point of life. In a bid to reject the old Whig history, educationalists have insisted that children engage in endless critical dissections of the past, but without knowing the narrative first, or knowing the Whig version first, how can children even consider challenging it? There is a third strand to the debate, beyond culture and education, and it has been a phenomenon that has affected Western societies throughout the post-war era. There has been an overall retreat from politics and from an engagement with the political for much of the last 7 decades. During the 1930s, politics was an activity with mass appeal and mass engagement. During the Great Depression, as seen by the mass membership of groups like the Left Book Club, for example. Victor Galanza's Socialist Weekly, the Left Book Club, was a reading society that sent monographs about everything from Soviet Russia to the anti-fascist movement and the Spanish Civil War to the homes of ordinary Britons. And by the middle of the decade, it had millions of members. Similarly, the Peace Pledge Union that vowed never to allow Britain to go to war again, or the anti-fascist movement, or the British Union of Fascists itself, if you want an example from the other end of the political spectrum, and both Labour and Conservative parties all had vast swathes of the population actively connected to politics, doing it, thinking about it, working in it. In the decades after the war, not only had the illusions of the left been punctured by one after one, as the truth about the USSR emerged in the crushing of the Hungarian uprising in 1956 and the destruction of the Czech democracy movement in 1968. But the same thing has happened to the dreams of the adherents of far-right free market doctrines. From the 1970s onwards, economists like Milton Friedman in the US and Sir Alan Walters in the UK made the connection, not that there was much of one, between free markets and liberal democracy, arguing that in order for people to be free, that capital must also be free to do what it wants as well. The results, as we can see from 2008 onwards, have been largely catastrophic for most of us. And a small coterie, who capital has benefited immensely, still attempt to champion the neoliberal argument as much as they can, whenever they can. So, with the two sides of the great economic argument of the past century discredited, and it has been an argument that has overshadowed everything else, is it any surprise that the endless now is so alluring? Is it any surprise that parents and even grandparents tell their young people, don't waste your time on history, there are no answers there? Perhaps not. And yet the tragedy is that there are answers in history. A young person who does not understand their past has a vastly impaired ability to navigate their present, and the past is not content to leave us alone. The financial crises that we have endured in the past few years that have rocked our world so deeply are the productions of the past, of the evolution of our ideas and the unchecked growth in our institutions, and studying economic history at least could help us insulate ourselves against future financial shocks. If you want to educate your children in a little practical history, this won't help with the Battle of Hastings, but we'll just have to live with that one for the time being. Show them what a sound investment looks like. Explain to them that investing in paper money, government gilts or bonds is a weak, inflation-vulnerable move, and that property, commerce and land is a rock-solid proposition. Our forebears knew this. The wealthy men in Tudor, Stuart, Georgian and Victorian times understood it well, and they also knew their history too.